They say when something feels wrong, it probably is. But when you've spent years with someone, it's easy to dismiss the small things, to convince yourself that you're imagining it. That's what I did. I told myself the late nights, the changes in her mood, the little shifts in her routine, they were all nothing. Just work stress, just life. But deep down, I knew better. Henry is 34. My wife, Jody, is 30, and we've been married for 5 years. I work as a taxi driver, navigating the chaos of the city streets while Jody bakes delicate pastries and breads in a cozy shop downtown. She's always loved baking. It's her passion, something she's been doing since she was a teenager. I used to admire how much joy it brought her. I loved hearing her talk about the new recipes she wanted to try or the regular customers who'd rave about her creations. But recently, Jody has been different. It's hard to explain. She still talks about work, still smiles when she mentions the new cake she's perfected or the compliments she's received. But there's a distance in her voice, a distracted edge that wasn't there before. I didn't notice it at first. Life gets busy, my shifts are long, her days are hectic, and we've always trusted each other to handle things on our own. But trust can only go so far when things don't add up. The first sign was subtle. Her schedule changed. Jody started coming home later than usual, saying she was staying behind to help clean up or test new recipes. It wasn't unusual for her to put in extra hours, especially during busy times like holidays or special events. But this wasn't seasonal, it was consistent. Week after week, she'd text me around 7 or 8, saying she'd be home late, only to walk through the door hours later, smelling faintly of something floral, a scent I hadn't noticed before. Then there was her appearance. Jody had always been effortlessly beautiful, the kind of person who didn't need to try to look good. She never cared much about makeup or fancy clothes, content to throw on jeans and a t-shirt for work. But lately, she'd started putting in more effort, curling her hair, wearing subtle makeup, even dabbing on perfume before heading out. When I commented on it, she'd laugh and brush it off, saying she just wanted to feel put together for work. It sounded reasonable, but something about the way she said it didn't sit right. Her phone became another puzzle piece. Jody had always been open with her phone, leaving it on the counter while she baked or handing it to me to look up recipes. But now, it was always with her, tucked into her pocket or face down on the table. When it buzzed, she'd glance at it quickly and smile faintly before putting it away. It wasn't obvious, but it was enough to make me wonder who she was texting and why she never mentioned it. At first, I brushed off my suspicions. Jody was social by nature, always chatting with co-workers and customers. It wasn't unusual for her to have friends she talked to outside of work. But then there were the little things she couldn't explain away. Like the time I noticed a fresh lemon tart in the fridge, one of her specialties. When I asked about it, she said it was an extra from the shop, but her tone was off, too quick, too rehearsed. Or the time I found a note scribbled on a scrap of paper that said, "Your smile made my day." It was folded and tucked into the pocket of her apron, almost like she'd forgotten about it. When I asked her about it, she shrugged it off, saying a customer had left it with a tip. But there was something about the way she said it, too casual, too dismissive, that made me pause. Over the next few weeks, the distance between us grew. Jody was still her usual cheerful self in public, still full of energy when she talked about her work. But at home, she seemed distracted, preoccupied with something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Her stories about the pastry shop were vaguer than usual, her laughter less frequent. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just the stress of long hours and demanding customers. But deep down, the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. One evening, while Jody was at work, I decided to clean the apartment. It was a slow day for me, and I figured I'd surprise her by tidying up. As I picked up her bag to move it off the couch, something fell out, a small envelope. Curious, I opened it, expecting to find a receipt or a list of ingredients. Instead, it was a thank you card, simple and plain, with a handwritten note inside. "Last night was perfect. I haven't smiled like that in years. Can't wait to see you again." My hands shook as I held the card, my mind racing. Who had written this? And why was it in Jody's bag? I told myself it couldn't mean what I thought it did. Maybe it was from a friend, a coworker, or even a customer who appreciated her kindness. But the words felt too personal, too intimate to ignore. I decided not to say anything. Not yet. Instead, I put the card back exactly where I found it and resolved to pay closer attention. If there was more to this, I needed to know for sure before confronting her. In the days that followed, I watched Jody more carefully, noting the little details I'd ignored before. The way she hesitated before answering my questions about work. The way she avoided eye contact when I mentioned her late nights. The way her phone always seemed to buzz when she thought I wasn't looking. Each moment felt like another piece of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. Something was happening, something Jody wasn't telling me. And for the first time in our marriage, I wasn't sure if I wanted to know the truth. As the days went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Jody's late nights, her sudden secrecy, and that thank you card tucked in her bag. It all pointed to something she wasn't telling me. But it was her silence that began to speak louder than anything else. Jody had always been animated when she talked about work. She loved sharing stories about her day. The regulars who came in for their morning croissants, the kids who stared wide-eyed at the colorful pastries in the display case, and the satisfaction of creating something from scratch. I used to love hearing her talk about it, her eyes lighting up as she described the new recipes she was experimenting with. But recently, those stories had started to disappear. She'd still mention work, but only in passing. Instead of the detailed anecdotes I'd grown used to, her responses were short and vague. "It was busy today," she'd say, or "nothing much happened." When I tried to ask more, she'd deflect, saying she was tired or distracted by something else. It wasn't like her. Jody thrived on connection, on sharing the little moments of her day. And now, it felt like she was deliberately keeping me at arm's length. The shift wasn't immediate. It crept in gradually, like a shadow growing longer as the sun set. At first, I told myself it was just fatigue. Running a pastry shop was demanding, especially during busy seasons, and Jody had always worked hard to meet the expectations of her boss and customers. But the more I thought about it, the less that explanation made sense. She'd handled busy seasons before without shutting me out. This was different. I started paying closer attention to the little things. Jody's phone, which used to sit on the counter while we ate dinner, was now always in her hand or tucked away. She used to chat with me while getting ready for work, but now she'd rush out the door with little more than a quick goodbye. Even her body language had changed, where she used to lean into me when we sat together on the couch. Now she'd sit at the far end, scrolling on her phone or staring off into space. Her silence about work was the most telling. One evening, I casually asked how her day had gone, and for a moment, she hesitated. It was subtle, just a flicker of something across her face, but it was enough to catch my attention. "The usual," she said quickly, her tone too light, too rehearsed. She changed the subject almost immediately, asking about my day instead. It was the first time I realized how much effort she was putting into avoiding certain topics. I couldn't help but think back to the thank you card I'd found. "Last night was perfect. I haven't smiled like that in years. Can't wait to see you again." The words replayed in my mind like a broken record, and each time, they felt heavier. Who had written it? And what did they mean by last night? The card had been in her bag for days before I found it, so whatever had happened wasn't recent. But it was enough to plant a seed of doubt I couldn't ignore. Jody's change in behavior wasn't just about her silence. It was about the distance she was creating between us. It was in the way she avoided eye contact when I asked about her day. It was in the way she laughed less, the way she seemed preoccupied even when we were sitting together in the same room. It was in the way she stopped talking about the regulars she used to adore, the customers who made her job feel meaningful. And it was in the way she seemed to smile at her phone more than she smiled at me. I didn't want to confront her. Not yet. If I was wrong, I'd only push her further away. But if I was right, I needed to know more before saying anything. I started keeping mental notes of the inconsistencies, the little moments that didn't add up. The late nights, the unexplained receipts, the thank you card, the guarded phone. It was all starting to paint a picture I didn't want to see. One night, as I sat alone in the living room while Jody worked late again, I found myself staring at her empty seat on the couch. The silence in the apartment felt heavier than usual, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. I thought about the woman I'd married, The one who used to fill the room with laughter and stories, and I wondered where she'd gone. Or maybe she was still there, hiding behind a wall I couldn't see. Jody's behavior had been gnawing at me for weeks. The subtle shifts in her demeanor and the growing distance between us more obvious now than ever. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I wanted to believe it was just work stress, that the long hours and demanding customers were wearing her down, but deep down, I knew there was more to it. Still, I decided to approach the situation delicately, hoping to find a way to bridge the gap between us. One evening, after dinner, I brought up the idea of Jody exploring other job opportunities. It wasn't the first time we'd talked about her work, but this time I framed it differently. I mentioned how talented she was, how her baking skills could easily land her a higher-paying job or even give her the chance to open her own shop someday. She'd always been ambitious, and I thought appealing to that side of her might spark a conversation about what was bothering her. Jody's reaction, however, caught me off guard. She didn't light up at the idea of a better-paying job or new opportunities. Instead, her face tensed, and she brushed off my suggestion with a curt smile. "I like where I am," she said, her tone dismissive. "The regulars appreciate me, and the owner gives me the freedom to experiment with recipes. I don't need anything else." Her words struck me as odd. Jody had always been someone who wanted more, a better future, a better career, more freedom. Her sudden insistence that she was perfectly content felt out of character, almost like she was shutting down the conversation before it could go anywhere. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. There was a defensiveness in her tone, a subtle edge that made me pause. I tried to dig deeper, asking if she was sure she didn't want to at least explore her options. I told her I'd heard about a new bakery opening up downtown that was looking for experienced pastry chefs, and that they were offering a significant salary bump. But she barely acknowledged it, shrugging and saying she didn't want to start over somewhere new. "The customers here know me," she added, her voice softening slightly. "It's nice to feel appreciated." Her mention of the customers stuck with me. It wasn't unusual for Jody to talk about the regulars who came into the shop. She'd always enjoyed the interactions and the sense of community they brought. But the way she said it now felt different. It wasn't just pride in her work or satisfaction in being recognized for her talents. It felt personal, almost too personal, like there was something or someone she wasn't telling me about. After that conversation, I couldn't stop thinking about her reaction. Why was she so resistant to the idea of change? Why did she seem so attached to the customers at her current job? And why did she react so defensively when I tried to bring it up? The questions circled in my mind, each one adding to the unease that had been growing since I found the thank you card in her bag. Over the next few days, I watched her more closely, looking for any clues that might explain her behavior. She continued to work late, her excuses always vague and unconvincing. She still guarded her phone, checking it quickly when it buzzed, and putting it away before I could see who was texting her. And she still seemed distant, her laughter and warmth replaced by a quiet detachment that made the house feel colder. The thing that stood out most, though, was how often she brought up her regular customers. It wasn't unusual for her to mention them. She'd always enjoyed sharing stories about the people who came into the shop. But now she talked about them more frequently, almost obsessively. She'd mention how one customer always ordered the same thing, or how another complimented her on a new pastry she created. She spoke about them with a fondness that felt deeper than it should have been, as if they were more than just customers to her. One name came up more than the others, a man named Eric. He was a regular who, according to Jody, came in almost every day for a coffee and a slice of lemon tart. She mentioned him casually at first, saying how much he loved her baking and how he always left a generous tip. But the more she talked about him, the more I noticed the way her voice softened when she said his name, the way her eyes seemed to light up just a little. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was letting my suspicions get the better of me. But the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. The more Jody talked about her customers, the more I felt like she was trying to justify her attachment to her job, to the people she saw every day. And the more she avoided my suggestions about finding a better opportunity, the more I felt like she was hiding something. I didn't push her further. I knew that if I kept pressing, she'd only shut down more, and I didn't want to risk driving her further away. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that there was more to her resistance than just loyalty to her job. Something or someone was keeping her there, and I needed to figure out what it was. I'll admit, I wasn't expecting much from that night. My schedule as a taxi driver meant I was used to odd hours, ferrying strangers to their destinations while my wife, Jody, handled the early mornings at the pastry shop. That night, she mentioned she'd be going out with some colleagues to a bar downtown after a shift. It wasn't unusual for her to go out once in a while, though I couldn't help but notice that these outings had become more frequent lately. I didn't think much of it. I was too focused on my own work. My shift was typical at first, picking up fares, listening to tired conversations, and navigating the maze of city streets. It was nearing midnight when I got a request for a pickup from a bar. The name immediately caught my attention. It was the same place Jody had mentioned she'd be going with her colleagues. I thought it was a funny coincidence. Out of all the bars in the city, I'd been called to the one where my wife was supposed to be. I couldn't help but wonder if I'd catch a glimpse of her while I was there. The request came from a man named Eric. The name gave me pause. It was familiar. Too familiar. Jody had mentioned him more than once during our conversations about her customers. Always in that light, almost too casual tone that had started to make me uneasy. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Eric was a common name, after all. But as I drove toward the bar, a sense of unease settled over me. When I arrived, the scene outside the bar was chaotic. Groups of people spilled onto the sidewalk, laughing and talking loudly, their voices carrying over the sound of music from inside. I parked near the entrance and waited for my passenger. A few moments later, the door opened, and Eric climbed into the back seat. And then, to my shock, Jody followed him. She was laughing, her face flushed from drinking, and she didn't even glance at me as she slid into the car beside him. Her attention was entirely on Eric, her hand brushing against his arm as she leaned in to whisper something I couldn't hear. My chest tightened as I watched the two of them through the rearview mirror, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Jody didn't even recognize me. She was too focused on Eric, too caught up in whatever they were sharing to notice that her husband was the one driving the car. I couldn't believe it. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't the time to confront her. I needed to think, to figure out what to do next. As I started driving, I glanced at the rearview mirror again. Eric was leaning closer to Jody, his voice low and smooth, while she giggled and nodded along. It was the kind of interaction that left no room for misinterpretation. They weren't just colleagues or friends. There was something more happening here, something Jody had been hiding from me. I decided to act. Confronting her in the moment wasn't an option. I didn't want to cause a scene or give her a chance to explain her way out of it. Instead, I needed proof, something undeniable, something that would force her to face the truth. As I drove, I discreetly turned on the voice recorder on my phone, positioning it so it would pick up their conversation. It wasn't easy, keeping my composure while my wife flirted with another man in the back seat of my car, but I knew I needed to stay calm. Every word they exchanged was another piece of the puzzle, another piece of evidence I could use when the time came to confront her. The ride felt endless. Eric gave me an address that was only a few miles away, but the tension in the car made every second stretch. When we arrived, I stopped the car and watched as Jody and Eric climbed out, still laughing, still oblivious to the fact that I'd been their driver. They disappeared into the building, leaving me alone with the weight of what I'd just witnessed. I sat there for a moment, my mind spinning. The recording was still running, capturing the quiet of the car now that they were gone. I turned it off and stared at my phone, the evidence I collected feeling both empowering and devastating. I had proof now, proof of Jody's betrayal. But what was I supposed to do with it? As I drove away, I replayed the events of the night in my mind. The way Jody had laughed, the way she'd leaned into Eric, the way she hadn't even noticed me. It all felt surreal. This was the woman I'd built my life with, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone. And now, everything was falling apart. When I got home, the apartment felt emptier than usual. I sat in the quiet, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the city outside. The recording sat on my phone, a tangible reminder of what I'd uncovered, and I knew it was only the beginning. Planning Jody's birthday celebration was both cathartic and heartbreaking. After what I'd witnessed and the evidence I'd collected, confronting her directly felt too easy, too straightforward. She'd lied to me, betrayed me, and turned our marriage into a charade. I didn't just want her to admit what she'd done. I wanted her to feel the weight of it. I wanted her to understand that the truth couldn't be hidden anymore. Not from me. Not from anyone. Her birthday was the perfect opportunity. Jody loved being the center of attention, and every year we hosted a party with friends and family to celebrate her day. She looked forward to it, basking in the love and admiration of those closest to her. This year, however, I had something very different planned. A few days before the party, I called her bakery and placed an anonymous order for a custom cake. The request was simple, a standard birthday cake with the words, "I know everything," piped in bold letters across the top. I made sure to provide enough detail that it wouldn't raise suspicion, but vague enough to keep the order under wraps until the day of the celebration. The day of the party arrived, and I played the role of the loving husband perfectly. I invited her friends, her family, even a few co-workers, ensuring the guest list was as complete as possible. Jody was glowing as everyone arrived, thanking me repeatedly for putting everything together. She had no idea what was coming. The party unfolded like any other. Guests mingled, laughed, and toasted to Jody's happiness. She floated through the crowd, her smile as bright as ever, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. I stayed close, watching her closely, my heart pounding as the evening progressed. When it was time for the cake, I excused myself to retrieve it. I carried it out carefully, the candles flickering softly as I placed it on the table in front of her. Jody's face lit up with delight, and everyone began to clap, their voices joining in a cheerful rendition of "Happy Birthday." But as the song ended and she leaned forward to blow out the candles, the mood in the room shifted. Instead of the usual festive tune, a recording began to play over the speakers I'd discreetly set up earlier that day. It was the recording I'd made the night I drove her and Eric from the bar. Their conversation, their laughter, the flirtation that left no room for doubt about their relationship. The room went silent as the recording filled the space, each word hanging in the air like a dagger. Jody froze, her face turning pale as she realized what was happening. The guests looked around in confusion, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock as the recording continued. I stood silently, watching as the truth unraveled before her. The words she thought would remain private now echoing in front of everyone she cared about. When the recording ended, the silence was deafening. Jody's hands trembled as she stared at the cake in front of her. The words, "I know everything," staring back at her like a cruel punchline. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mix of anger, fear, and something that almost looked like regret. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Everything I'd wanted to say was already out there, laid bare for everyone to hear. The room was heavy with tension, the cheerful atmosphere replaced by an overwhelming sense of betrayal. Jody's friends and family began whispering, their voices hushed as they tried to process what they'd just heard. Jody stood abruptly, knocking over her chair as she turned and fled the room. The door slammed behind her, leaving the rest of us in stunned silence. I stayed where I was, my heart pounding as I looked around the room, taking in the faces of our guests, her mother, her co-workers, the people who had trusted her as much as I had. Finally, I spoke. "I think that's enough of a celebration for tonight." My voice was calm, steady, and resolute. "Thank you all for coming. I'll be in touch." As the guests began to leave, some offering awkward apologies or words of support, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was over. The lies, the deception, the betrayal. It was all out in the open now. There was no turning back. Looking back, I know that exposing Jody in such a public way wasn't just about her. It was about me reclaiming my dignity. For too long, I'd allowed myself to ignore the signs, to brush off the little things that didn't add up. This experience taught me that trust is fragile, and once it's broken, there's no easy way to repair it.